Spoken grammar, why is it important? That's a loaded question. It means I already assume it is important, and I'm going to tell you why. But I'm going to start with a bit of history. We're here, all of us, thanks to Cambridge University Press, which, as you know, is the oldest press in the world. And when it was founded by King Henry VIII, at the time of King Henry VIII's reign, people were learning languages. People in England, usually rich people and usually men, were learning Latin. Now, there's a little schoolboy's poem that says, Latin is a language as dead can be. It killed the ancient Romans, and now it's killing me. But at that time, at the time of Henry VIII, Latin was quite a useful language. You needed it to travel around Europe. Just as today you could say you need English to go to different countries, at that time you needed Latin. But you didn't need it to write. You needed it to speak to people in France or Italy or Spain or Portugal. And the young men of England would get on their horses, get into their coaches, and do what was called the Grand Tour. They would travel around Europe, learning to be gentlemen, and they would meet other gentlemen, and they would speak to them in Latin. What they learned in their schools in England was actually spoken Latin. They learned spoken grammar. And in Cambridge University Library, we have these original textbooks. They were called Vulgaria. And if you know Latin, you will know that Vulgaria means ordinary things, the things of the common people. And the language which these textbooks taught was the language of the common people, the vulgar. Vulgar has a much more negative meaning in modern English, but its original meaning simply means the people. So they were learning Latin, learning to speak Latin, not to write it, and learning the language of the ordinary people. Then everything changed. Science came in. And the language of science was also Latin, but it was a language for writing. And it became so important as the language of thought, language of intellectual pursuit, that the spoken grammars died. And for several centuries, grammars of English and grammars of Latin were all based upon the written language. And that situation persisted right down the centuries until, shall we say, the end of the last century, the end of the 20th century. Then it changed, and there are good reasons why things changed and why I'm here today able to talk about spoken grammar without feeling embarrassed, without feeling I'm talking about a suspicious subject, a subject that we only mention in whispers. And of course, two things changed. One was the advent of sound recording technology. And not just the ability to record sound, but to do it on very small pieces of equipment. Walkman, little digital recorders, small microphones like this one. So for the first time, we were able to capture the language of the ordinary people. Not the language of the orators, the Winston Churchills or the Martin Luther Kings. The language of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Having dinner, cooking dinner, traveling in a car, chatting to their colleagues at work, chatting to other students in their halls of residence. We were able to capture these voices. The other major change was the advent of computers and software which could analyze the spoken language. Now, I'm not talking today about the phonetic aspects of spoken language. I'm talking about spoken language which has been transcribed faithfully and stored in a computer as a corpus. A corpus is just a collection of texts stored in the computer. So if, for example, I wanted to find out as much as possible about a language like Italian. A good idea would be to take all the newspapers published in Italy for a whole year and put their text into a computer. This would be my corpus, plural corpora, okay? From the Latin, corpus meaning a body, not to be confused with corpse, which is a dead body, okay? So I'm going to be talking about corpora, and I'm going to be talking about how a corpus can help us understand everyday, ordinary, vulgar spoken language. And I'm saying vulgar in that traditional sense of the word. Then I'll talk about whether we should teach this, how important it is, and how we might go about teaching it. Now, Rupert Daniels kindly introduced me as a professor, so I suppose I'm an academic. I have to start off by looking at the literature on spoken language. So we're going to jump 500 years from the time of King Henry to the time of the present Queen Elizabeth. And with a bit of luck, we'll see if this works. There we go. We'll see some of the discussions about spoken grammar that have taken place in the last 20 years or so. I choose 20 years because it is, in fact, more or less exactly 20 years, a little bit more, since my colleague Ronald Carter and I published 2 articles about spoken grammar. Innocent little academic articles, which caused an explosion of rage and outrage in the academic community. You would have thought we were advocating committing some horrendous crime, the reaction that we got. And it took a long time for the dust to settle, as we say. In the literature, myself and my colleague Ronald Carter in 1995 pointed out that there were bits of grammar in everyday conversation that were quite different or sometimes absent from the grammar of writing. Okay, so we were looking at speaking, everyday speaking, and we were finding pieces of grammar that were either absent from writing or which were just not very common in writing. Douglas Biber and his colleagues at the University of Flagstaff, Northern Arizona, the University of Northern Arizona at Flagstaff, published a wonderful grammar in 1999, big grammar, with another publisher whose name we dare not mention in this Cambridge conference. Differences of distribution and function of grammatical items. What they did was they took 4 types of language. They took fiction, novels and short stories. They took newspapers. They took academic writing, and they took everyday conversation. And they found there were quite significant differences. The late great grammarian Geoffrey Leach, who sadly died 2 years ago, in the year 2000, pointed out that conversation was different from writing because it is produced online. In real time, it is linear. When we construct our speaking, we're not thinking, now I need a subordinate clause which I will embed in a main clause, and I'll probably have an adverbial phrase in there somewhere. Oh yes, that has to go in that place there. And of course, this results in quite short utterances. If you look at a corpus of conversation, you do not find well-formed sentences like those which I'm speaking now. Most people just grunt. Yeah, 2 o'clock. Oh, okay. Yeah, right. See you then. Yeah, right, yeah. There's a lot of that. Christoph Ruhlmann in Germany, an up-and-coming, brilliant, younger linguist. I say young, he's probably about 50, but to me he's young. Christoph Ruhlmann in 2007 said, conversation is where we find the most outstanding differences between speaking and writing. So if we want to look at the grammar of speaking, we don't look at what I'm doing now, a formal lecture. Where you find the really important differences is in everyday conversation. Now I'm going to look at some key features of spoken grammar in the time that remains to me. I've just chosen 3. I'm going to talk about co-construction, the strategic use of tenses, and something called situational ellipsis. Now, if these are terms that you're not familiar with, doesn't matter. I hope they will become clear in the next 20 minutes or so. Let's start with co-construction. Co-construction simply means doing things together, okay? It doesn't mean bricks and mortar and making buildings. Student says, well, so I've no lectures. I have to do the research myself. He's talking about writing a dissertation or an essay. You have to do it yourself, says the other student. And the first student says, which is harder, like. And a third student comes in and says, which would be very difficult, I'd say. And the first student says, yeah. Now, what is interesting here is we have all the appearances of some good sentences. You know, you have a main clause, and you have these clauses with which. Yeah? They are subordinate clauses. They are WH clauses. They are these classic which, non-defining relative or comment clauses, as they're called in writing. What always fascinates me is, number one, these are very common. Number two, they're often spoken by the same person. Number three, they're often spoken by a different person. Number four, nobody ever says, you stay out of my sentence, you make your own sentences. Who do you think you are, hanging a which subordinate clause onto my main clause? That's my clause. You are not engaged in a monologue when you're in conversation. It's not, oh, it's my turn, right, my monologue. Now it's your monologue. Now it's her monologue. We create the whole thing together. We do it with which. We can also do it with if. We could go to the beach tomorrow, says one. Another person says, if the weather's fine. Yeah? So you have a classic conditional sentence created by two people. Here we have a nice sentence with which clauses created by three people. It is so ordinary, so common, so vulgar in that best sense of the word. Why is it important then? Why should we get excited about this? Well, it's important because it facilitates the following things. Interpersonal bonding. That's what conversation is about. It is a social action with which one human being bonds with another. It enables the negotiation of meaning. Meaning isn't something that's established beforehand. You have to work out, what is this person trying to say to me? What am I trying to say to him or her? We negotiate it. But perhaps most important for us as language teachers, it enables what I call flow. It enables the conversation to flow. This is an important element of fluency, the ability to hook your clause onto the previous speaker. And there's a good deal of research to support that. Research outside of our profession, research in sociology, which shows that perceptions of fluency have an important role in how we judge other people in a job interview. Some sociology research has shown that if you are heard, if you are perceived as fluent, you will get a better job. So these things are quite fundamentally important. They are not just academic, abstract things. They are the meat and drink of everyday language. Okay, how do you present this kind of thing? Well, you have to go beyond the normal sort of grammar chart. You can't just say, you know, this is how you form a which clause. We know that. We teach that. You have to show in a conversational context. You have to illustrate it. Your students are not going to come into class next Monday and say, teacher, can you teach us how to attach subordinate clauses onto the other person's speaking turn? You'd be very lucky. You'd have wonderful students if they said that, you know. Come on, you must know it, you know. How do I use a which clause to attach to the other person's speech so that I sound fluent? I didn't wake up one morning myself realizing how important these were. The computer brought them up for me from the corpus. The computer said, this is a very common way of using the word which. So then, of course, there is a comprehension phase. What do these things mean? You have to help students notice these things. It's a question of observation, you see. Your students don't have a corpus. They don't have a... They're not going to go and search some big corpus with a computer. What we want them to do is to wake up and notice things that happen in ordinary conversation. Find more examples in the conversation. Here's a conversation from a well-known textbook. This is a typical conversation of Anna and Pedro. And Anna says, "Did you see that video clip I emailed you?" "No, I don't generally tend to watch them," which is unusual, I guess. What was it? "Oh, it's a couple of talking cats. It's hilarious." Yeah? I don't mind the funny ones. You know what I don't like? People do really dangerous things in video, like riding bikes off walls, which is stupid, I know. So you can see this is typical conversation that you get in the corpus. We take our conversations from the corpus, we adapt them, we remove some of the more incomprehensible bits, and in it we have some of these typical which clauses. The first one is spoken by Pedro himself, the second one is spoken by another speaker, and then we have another one down there. So there they are. They're not unusual, but we don't notice them in everyday conversation. I hope when you leave here, you will start to notice them, because they are very, very common. This is not unusual grammar. It always scares me when I go to conferences and people say, "Oh, well, have you written anything for the advanced level?" And I say, "Yes, I have. You know, Cambridge has published advanced materials that I've written." Again, I won't mention them, but you know, from my own viewpoint, they're very important. And I always say, yes, have a look at this. And they look and they're searching through. And you say, "Can I help you?" And they say, "Yes, I'm looking for the subjunctive." "Oh, yes. Some people won't buy it if it doesn't have the subjunctive in it. I didn't even know English had a subjunctive." It does, but it's very rare. It's extremely rare. Of course, then we want to, once we raise this awareness, this noticing, we need to practice things. And it's important. Our philosophy is practice within the students' language abilities. You want them to practice this co-construction feature, so don't make it terribly, terribly difficult by saying, have a discussion about deep-sea thermovental apertures under the ocean. You know, it's got to be something that's within their abilities, that is relevant and familiar activity type. You don't need a new type of activity to teach what is effectively a very old piece of grammar. Topics that are easy to talk about. Supportive. Examples of what people really do say, and that's why we need the corpus. It's very difficult to know what you say. It's very easy to know what you write. I remember when I started as an English teacher, I was in that wonderful position of being the native speaker at the school in Spain. People would say, "Ask him," you know? And they would come to me and they would say, "Mike, you know, which is correct, da-da-da-da, or da-da-da-da-da?" And I would say, well, now let me think. And that was dangerous, let me think. Because the moment I would say, "Let me think," what was I thinking about? I was thinking about how I write, or what my grammar teacher taught me at school. What is really difficult is to know what you say. And there's plenty of research that shows that neither native speakers nor expert users of English know what they say. Okay? I've been at conferences and I've said, right, the most frequent two-word phrase in speaking in English is "you know." Okay? And I say, in a corpus of 5 million words, there are 12,000 examples of "you know." It's one of the most important phrases in the language. And then in the question and answer sessions afterwards, there's always someone who says, "Yes, but this is not good English. I don't want to teach my students things like 'you know.' I want to teach them proper English, you know." And they always do it. Okay, so we don't know how we speak, and research shows that we don't know. It is very difficult to be objective about something that is linear, real-time, online, live, temporary, disappears into the air. You need to record it. You need to analyze it. Now, the computer is dispassionate. The computer has no prejudices about the language. The computer doesn't say, this is common, but be careful. It's not very good English. The computer simply says, this is what you say, and this is how many times you say it. It's up to you then to decide what to do with that information. And of course, last but not least, there is no point in teaching these spoken grammar features unless you make it possible for the students to personalize and relate it to their own lives. And the practice should be as practice. It's not a test, because what's the point in testing it when it's not part of their normal grammar learning in that sense? The practice phase leads into what we then call induction, which is where the student works out in his or her own mind what the principle or rule is behind the activity. Now, in this case, it's grammar with a difference. It's not grammar as rules. A rule would be, we use which for things and who for persons. That's a rule. This is nothing to do with rules. This is what my colleague Ronald Carter and I call the grammar of choice. It is a choice which you make in order to create better interaction. You don't have to say which is difficult, which must be difficult. You can say it must be difficult. Perfectly correct, but not as fluent, not as interactive as saying which must be difficult. Yeah? If you say to me, I have to travel 30 miles to work every day, which must be really tiring. That is interactive, it flows. I have to travel to work 30 miles every day. It must be tiring. It's correct. It's not quite as fluent as the other version. Okay, let's have a look. Let's see, get some little practice things here. You just have to match the left and right. Do you email video clips to your friends all the time? No, it's a pain. I have a friend who's always sending clips, which is really annoying, so I take that from over there. I'll only send one if it's really interesting or funny, which is fine. Okay, so that's gone. They've gone from the box over to there. Let's move on to the next of our 3 points. That is the use of the tense and aspect system. Now, by tense, I mean references to time. English just has 2 tenses, present and past. English has no future, perhaps in more ways than one. English has no conditional. We have to make them up. We have to paraphrase them using words like will and going to and so on. Not like Spanish or French or other European languages which have nice future tenses and conditional tenses. What English does have, of course, is several aspects. Aspects we distinguish between simple and continuous, perfect and non-perfect. Yeah? So those are examples of aspect. Tenses are about time. Aspects are about the speaker's perspective on time. All right? They are your perspective, your subjective interpretation of time. That's why it's possible to say, I feel well, and it's equally possible to say, I'm feeling well. They're both perfectly correct. The only difference is your perspective, whether you're looking at it from the outside, I feel well, or you feel you're in the middle of something that's a process. I'm feeling well. Okay. I'm going to give you some examples again from the corpus. This is in a travel agents. They're a dying breed now, aren't they, travel agents? But when we made this recording, people still went to travel agents to book their holidays. And this person says, we were wanting to book a trip to Sardinia. And the travel agent didn't say, oh, well, I'm sorry you've changed your mind. Bye-bye. Past tense, we were wanting. I took this jacket to the cleaners, and I put it down on the counter, and I said, I'd like to have this cleaned, please. And the assistant said, yeah, what was the name? And I said, well, same as it's always been. I haven't changed it. And here's another one. Sally was telling me they're moving to Birmingham. There are hundreds of these in our corpus. We were wanting. Why not say we want? We want to book a holiday to Sardinia. Perfectly correct. Of course, you have two choices. You have three choices. You can say, we want to book a holiday, we wanted to book a holiday, or we are wanting, or even were wanting. So it's actually four choices. It's like that Monty Python sketch about the Spanish Inquisition. They keep adding more every time. So there are at least four possibilities for asking this question, for giving this information. This is 2 steps away from in your face. We want to book a holiday to Sardinia. Oh. We wanted, a little bit more distant. We were wanting, even more distant. Why do you want to be distant? Because you're asking somebody for a service, for a favor. And you want a good relationship with that person. You want them to help you. You want actually to bond interactively with them in some way. What was the name? Again, it's a polite form. Now, the third one, Sally was telling me we're moving to Birmingham. This one fascinated me because there were literally hundreds of these in our corpus. And then I looked at the books I'd written in the past in the section about reported speech, where we said the rule is this. Sally says, we're moving to Birmingham, and you have to change it to Sally said, or Sally told me they were moving to Birmingham. But the computer says that what people say hundreds of times is not Sally told me or Sally said, but Sally was saying. Sally was telling me. I was reading in the paper the other day. Past continuous form to report things that people say or things that people write. You don't find it in newspapers. You don't find the Prime Minister was saying in Parliament the other day that they're going to raise taxes. It's always the Prime Minister said, the Prime Minister declared, the Prime Minister stated. Because it is completely absent from writing, for decades it was absent from all the grammar books and all the course books. You look at them, you look at your course books, with one exception, of course. You look at your course books and you will see that this very, very common form is just not there. It's not in some of the big grammars of English, those which were published before 2006, I mean, when Cambridge published the Cambridge Grammar of English. And really, these forms were omitted, forgotten, because they are part of the grammar of speaking. And what we find is they always preface something interesting, something newsworthy, a new topic. It's a way of saying, listen up, okay? It's not a way of saying, I have a report to make to you of something that somebody said. It is a way of saying, here's some news, here's something I want you to listen to, here's a new topic. And so it is a signal of topic management. It is a signal to you, the listener, I've got something interesting to tell you. Not just English, I know it happens in Spanish. Sally me decía que, da 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 da. The thing with phrases like Sally was telling me, I was reading in the paper the other day, is that you really should not be sitting there thinking, I've got a piece of news. I'd better choose the past continuous before I tell her. Now, how's the past continuous? I was reading. No, have read. No, that's present perfect. These have to be automatic, immediate. They're little signals. They're little chunks. They are effectively grammatical chunks. We don't process them and invent them each time. They're just chunks. Here's some more examples of them. I was wondering if you could, I wanted to. Would it be all right if? Would it be okay with you? These little things like, would it be all right, the conditional use there. I was wondering, the past continuous. It's perfectly correct to say, I wonder, but if you can get these little chunks into your head, they're little prefaces to what you want to say. So we treat these as what I call lexicogrammar. They are partly treated like big words, lexis, and partly as grammar. They're important because they facilitate politeness and indirectness. We don't like to be in one another's face. Every language I've ever looked at in my life has ways of being indirect. It is a stupid myth to think that this is some character of the English, that they cannot be direct. Creates good relations, whether it's in a shop or whether it's with your colleagues at work or your friends. And it expresses your perspective on reality, your perspective on the situation, if you like. And so I'll finish with looking at situational ellipsis. Someone's changed that to situated ellipsis. It should say situational ellipsis anyway. And there are a couple of references, especially another misprint, I'm afraid. It should be Keynes and Buttery, B-U-T-T-E-R-Y. Andrew Keynes and Paula Buttery of this very university, Cambridge University, have done some wonderful work on this in Conversation. Ready yet? You talking to me? Hammer, please. Now, this last one I like because it's a recording of people doing a do-it-yourself job. You know, they're repairing or putting something together. And the one person says to the other, hammer, please. And the next thing that happens is the person gives them the hammer. She doesn't hit him over the head with the hammer, right? She gives him the hammer. So how does she know that what he wants is to be given the hammer? Well, of course, it's obvious in the situation. Conversations take place in situations. It seems obvious to say that, doesn't it? It seems very obvious, but it is true. Conversations take place in situations. And we only say what we need to say. No more. If you say more, people hear you as pedantic. But would you be so kind as to pass me the hammer, please? Husband to wife, wife to husband? If my wife said that to me, I'd begin to think she didn't love me anymore. Would you be so kind as to pass me the hammer, please? I'd say, what's wrong with you? What have I done now? Yeah? So these things are deeply meaningful. We say only what we need to say. Now, this is quite a revolutionary thing to conclude. Because traditionally, if you look at the traditional definitions of ellipsis, which is what this is called, ellipsis, it means leaving out, omitting things which should be there. But nothing is missing from here, is there? Is there something missing? If I say to the other person, hammer, please, the other person doesn't say, what do you mean, hammer, please? Do you want me to hit you over the head with a hammer, or do you want a hammer? Do you want me to go and buy a hammer? Do you think I look like a hammer? Of course not. Nothing is missing. Nothing is omitted from any of these messages. What we do when the situation is not obvious is, of course, we add things. We elaborate. That's why writing is more elaborate than conversation. It's very simple. Because written texts are written to be read and consumed, usually in a different place, in a different time. When a written text is meant to be read in situation, then it's just like conversation. You can go around Cambridge and see on walls, no bicycles. Okay? No bicycles. And everybody in Cambridge knows what that means. It means don't park your bicycle here. However, I passed the place the other day which rents bicycles to students. And there was a sign outside which said, no bicycles. And I realized that it meant we have rented them all out. We don't have any left. Don't bother coming to ask us. They're all gone. Okay? So you interpret things in the situation. You only say or write what you need to say. Of course, you can't do this all the time. There are some rules and principles. You can't run into a room and say, oh, I'm late. It doesn't work. So there are some underlying principles. Only the corpus can tell us when this happens and how it happens. We can write a grammar of ellipsis, but we need the evidence from our corpus. Here's a conversation. That's two people putting up a shelf. Do you need this screwdriver? Here it is. Thanks, I can't get this shelf off the wall. Do you want me to try getting it off for you? Yes, thanks. Are you sure you've got time? Yes, okay, that's done. Do you need help with anything else? Thank you. No, there's nothing else. Would you like a drink? I'd love one. Have you got any green tea? Sounds like a conversation you'd have with the Queen in Buckingham Palace, doesn't it? You know, you're helping the Queen to put up her bookshelves. Oh, well, are you sure you've got time? Now, what we can do with this when we've introduced the notion of ellipsis is say, instead of the usual type of activity of add an adverb after the verb or put in the missing preposition, this is the opposite. We're going to say, what can you take away from this and it's still good English? Well, you could get rid of that, couldn't we? Need this screwdriver? Here it is. Thanks. Can't get this shelf off the wall. Want me to try getting it off for you? And so on. You can have fun looking at what you can leave out, not just what you must put in. Nice, sort of friendly little exercise. And it gives you that flavor of naturalness, of natural conversation, and so on. Situational ellipsis is important because it facilitates this context-embedded, situationally determined interaction. It's what we do when we're doing things, whether it's cooking or putting up a shelf or driving a car or fixing up the projector here. Classically, it's a type of language that linguists have called language in action. Okay, that's the name for this type of language, language in action, where the activities and actions that people are doing determine how they use the language. It's informal. Yeah? So don't go to a job interview and the interviewer says, do tell me about your past career. Well, worked in McDonald's for 10 years, didn't like it, got bored. Okay, so you don't, you know, it is appropriate to informal, close friendship situations. It's economical, it's grammar, it's easy grammar. You know, we're always insisting that our students produce these beautiful, well-formed sentences. Most of conversation doesn't contain sentences at all. It contains utterances that are strung together. So where are we now? There is now a greater acceptance of the notion of spoken grammar, SGE, and applied linguistics in general. A lot of the arguments have happened in the 90s and the controversies have settled down. There are now numerous descriptive articles on spoken grammar which add much more to what I've talked about today. There is a strong influence in reference grammars. I'm very proud of my own grammar, the Cambridge Grammar of English, published in 2006. Special price today of two for the price of 3. Spoken grammar also brings with it a much better acceptance of diversity and varieties and variation in language. There is no one correct formal standard of spoken grammar. It respects and admires and actually encourages diversity and difference. Growing influence in course books, which I've already touched on. Growing importance now of multimodal corpora. If you want to understand the language of two people putting a shelf up, have a video of two people putting a shelf up. So this is why video is incredibly useful. And of course, recent technologies are really destroying this divide between spoken grammar and written grammar. What we can call e-grammar, the grammar of online communication, whether it be blogs or fora or emails or text messaging, they are much more like spoken grammar than they are like written grammar. So the future lies in spoken grammar, just as the past 500 years ago did. Thank you very much.